Hello again. In recent years, the subject of slavery has become quite literally a question of black and white. Upon hearing any mention of slavery, the mind of the average person in Britain or America turns unbidden and, as a matter of course, to the Atlantic slave trade, by means of which many black Africans were transported from their native continent to America and the islands of the Caribbean. For most of us, that is simply what slavery was: the historic mistreatment and exploitation of black people. It is widely accepted that anybody talking or writing about slavery must adopt this peculiar worldview and ensure that the central focus remains firmly upon black people. When we see a book in a library or bookshop called The Slave Trade, we have no doubt that when we open it, we should be seeing graphic descriptions of the horrors of the so-called Middle Passage, which saw millions of men, women, and children transported across the Atlantic Ocean in atrocious conditions. It is that grammatical feature, the definite article, which indicates what we are to expect. The word the gives the game away. It wasn't always like this, of course. The first written mention of slavery dates back as far as 2000 BC, and from that time up to the present day, slavery of one kind or another has been seen across the world, especially in Africa. Until relatively lately, nobody in Britain would have dreamt of referring to the trade from West Africa to the Americas and Caribbean as the slave trade. After all, Britain had its own experience of slavery to dwell upon. Every schoolchild knew about Caractacus being taken in chains to Rome after the yoke of Roman tyranny was nearly overthrown, and the fierce struggle with Boadicea, of course, to chuck the Romans out of the country. And then, too, there was that seminal story of how the English first acquired their national identity, the anecdote related by the Venerable Bede about an incident in the slave market in Rome. This story was once known to every schoolchild, but it's faded from our memory. The Venerable Bede was an ecclesiastical historian working in Britain during the Anglo-Saxon period. He told the story of Pope Gregory, who in the 6th century AD passed by a slave market in Rome. Seeing some beautiful fair-haired children for sale, he inquired as to their origin and was told that they were Angli or Angles, whereupon he made a pun in Latin. Gregory said, "Non Angli, sed Angeli," not Angles, but angels. It was after telling this story that Bede began referring to those living in the southeast part of Britain as English. Slavery was, until a few decades ago, known by every English person as something which their ancestors were likely to have endured. With the increasing emphasis on the transatlantic slave trade in both school history lessons and generally when the subject of slavery is mentioned, this early history of slavery involving English people has faded from memory. There's nothing sinister in the fact that the history taught to children today is different from that which featured in lessons 60 or 70 years ago. It does mean, though, that a very important part of British and indeed European history has been completely forgotten. This is the fact that centuries before Africans were kidnapped from their own countries and carried off to be slaves on another continent, people from Britain and other parts of Europe were suffering precisely the same fate, in that they were being snatched from their homes and carried off to be slaves in Africa. That this has simply vanished entirely from our awareness is clearly illustrated by an event which took place in the English city of Bristol a little over 3 years ago. On June 7th, 2020, the statue of Edward Colston, an 18th century slave trader, was pulled from its plinth in Bristol by an angry mob. They then dragged it to the harbour, where it was thrown into the water. This action was part of the protest which followed the death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer in the United States. But those who damaged the statue of Edward Colston were also marking their disapproval of the fact that Bristol was once a centre for the slave trade, which, as we observe these days, means the transatlantic slave trade. There was at the time a good deal of discussion of Bristol's history as a port involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but not one person mentioned the fact that it was a major centre for the trade in slaves a good 500 years before Columbus even crossed the Atlantic. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, Bristol was already an international centre for quite another kind of slave trade, that of exporting English slaves to Ireland and from there to Africa and Scandinavia. Slavery was a well established institution in Anglo Saxon England, and it continued to flourish even after the coming of the Normans. According to the Domesday Book, based on information collected in 1086, about a tenth of the English population were slaves. Slaves were at that time acquired by traders across the whole of England and then transported to Bristol to be sold at the market there for export to other countries, principally Ireland in the first instance. A contemporary writer described the scene at the Bristol slave market in the early 11th century. You could see and sigh over rows of wretches bound together with ropes, young people of both sexes whose beautiful appearance and youthful innocence might move barbarians to pity, daily exposed to prostitution, daily offered for sale. Bristol was popular with slave traders because it was a handy English port from which to sail to Dublin. Dublin, Ireland's town, was founded in 841 by Viking slavers, and its prosperity and growth were closely bound up with the slave trade. Waterford, too, of course. A couple of other Irish cities were originally slave trade centres. Some of the slaves brought to Dublin from Bristol were sold to buyers in Ireland, but others ended up in different parts of the world. It will perhaps come as a surprise to some modern viewers to learn that English slaves sold in Dublin were at that time being bought by dealers who then took them to Africa. Soon after Islam became established in what is now Saudi Arabia in the 7th century AD, it began to spread outward by means of military conquest, first across the whole of the Middle East and then into North Africa. By 720, not only was the Mediterranean coast of Africa entirely Muslim, but Europe too had been invaded and almost the whole of Spain absorbed into the Muslim world. Because the enslavement of Muslims was explicitly forbidden by Muhammad, the need for slaves had to be satisfied by acquiring non-Muslims from other parts of the world, for example Europe and what is now Russia. The Vikings were happy to oblige by engaging in this trade with Muslims and selling them white slaves whom they had captured. So it was that the English slaves exported from Bristol to the slave markets of Dublin were sometimes bought by those intending to take them to North Africa. It's probably fair to say that very few people in Britain are aware in this way that white English people were being exported as slaves to Africa well over 500 years before the transatlantic slave trade began. The slaves taken to Dublin in the 10th and 11th centuries were, though, only the beginning of a terrible scourge which will have a devastating effect upon Britain in later centuries. Having conquered the Middle East, spread as far as India and taken the Iberian Peninsula, the next logical step was for the forces of militant Islam to bring the rest of Europe into the fold. This proved more difficult than expected. From their bases in Spain, armies crossed the Pyrenees into France and then swept towards Paris. They were halted at the Battle of Poitiers in 732 and driven back to Spain. The desire to subdue Europe was abandoned and the focus was upon expanding the rule of Islam to the east rather than the west. With the establishment of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century, though, the dream of converting Europe to Islam rose again, and once more Muslim armies began to look towards Europe. The Ottoman Empire covered an enormous area in the 16th and 17th centuries, reaching its greatest extent in 1683, by which time Turkish forces were besieging Vienna. At that time, the empire stretched from Iran and included a large part of the Middle East. The modern countries of Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and much of Saudi Arabia were all under the sway of the Ottomans, as well as much of Eastern Europe. Greece, Albania, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Croatia, Slovakia, and Serbia, as well as parts of the Ukraine and Russia, were all either directly under the Ottoman thumb or were vassal states. In North Africa, Tripoli, which is roughly where present-day Libya now exists, Tunis, and Algiers were all autonomous provinces of the empire. It was in the 16th century that the so-called Barbary pirates became a force to be reckoned with. These were ships sailing from North African ports, an area which was at that time known in Europe as the Barbary Coast. Although we now describe those ships from Africa as pirates, that's not how they were seen at the time. With the Ottoman Empire gearing up for another assault on Europe by land armies, the raids by ships from Algiers and Tripoli could better be seen as probing attacks, which tested the ability of the European powers to respond to landings and attacks on shipping in their own territory. It must be borne in mind that these attacks on Europe from the sea were a counterpoint to Ottoman expansion on land. During the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire continued to grow at the expense of Europe, with new territory being swallowed up from Russia all the way to Austria and almost as far as Italy. In memories perhaps of the Muslim invasion of France in the 8th century, the sultans in Constantinople continued to press west into Central Europe on land and to harry the coasts of Spain, France, and England from the sea. Although the raids were part of a wider strategy designed to further the Muslim subjugation of Europe, the captains of the ships saw that there was a strong business end to these activities, and they enthusiastically captured as many slaves as they could from villages on the coasts of Italy, France, Spain, Ireland, Britain, and even as far away as Iceland. In the process, they managed to destabilise Britain to such an extent that a civil war racked the country. Between 1609 and 1616, a total of 466 English ships were boarded and the crews taken to North Africa as slaves. In April 1625, three ships from Cornwall and one sailing from Dartmouth in Devon were captured by corsairs and their crews taken. The following month, an entry in the calendar of state papers lamented that the Turks are upon our coast. They take ships only to take the men to make slaves of them. Because the Barbary coast was part of the Ottoman Empire, whose caliph was in Turkey, all Muslims were regularly referred to in England at this time as Turks. The bold seizure of English vessels was bad enough, but there was worse. The Royal Navy not only seemed unable to protect English ships at sea, even those close to the coast. They couldn't even prevent slavers actually landing and taking people onto their ships to be transported to the slave markets of Algiers. Raiding parties landed in Cornwall and Devon and captured whole villages, took them off into slavery. All this makes strange reading today. We're familiar with the rout of the Spanish Armada by the Royal Navy in the late 16th century, and yet now we see that that same navy was seemingly quite unable to protect the English coast from the depredations of what was being dismissed at the time as a handful of pirates. The boldness and frequency of the expeditions against the British Isles was really extraordinary. Sometimes more than one ship would be attacked simultaneously. In 1634, two ships carrying goods from Minehead in Somerset to Ireland were attacked and the crews captured. At other times, the African ships would work like a wolf pack to take a ship which they had targeted. On the 20th of September 1635, what were described as 6 Sally men of war seized a ship near the Scilly Isles, which lie off the westernmost tip of Cornwall. The following March, it was reported that 36 ships from England, Scotland, and Ireland had been taken, and in June that year, 3 fishing boats containing over 50 men had been captured between Falmouth and the Lifford. In August 1638, it was reported that Turkish men of war of Algiers were operating in the English Channel. The fact that the ships slipping in and out of British territories were being described as men of war is significant. This was the term applied only to warships and not generally to pirate vessels. The English at that time recognised that these raids were tantamount to an act of war and the ships were really representatives of a hostile foreign power, namely the Ottoman Empire. Britain was not the only target for these hit and run raids. The Mediterranean was also becoming the focus for Muslim expansion, and there the naval warfare often turned into traditional sea battles between European powers and the Ottomans. It was not until Oliver Cromwell assumed control of England that the menace of the enemy's ships, which had been harassing the waters around the British Isles, was brought to an end. He dispatched an expedition to Tunis in 1655, which had a salutary effect on the ruler of that province of the Ottoman Empire. Punitive ventures of this kind are notoriously expensive, and ultimately the British began simply paying the rulers of the provinces of North Africa to leave British shipping unmolested. It was in the early 19th century that ships sailing from North Africa were finally deterred from their actions, and it was to be the Americans who accomplished this task. But that, as they say, is another story. That people from the British Isles were once snatched from their homes by slave raiders and carried off to Africa to be sold as slaves is probably unknown to almost everybody in Britain. Learning that this kind of thing was happening centuries before the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade will perhaps cause a sharp intake of breath and raised eyebrows among some viewers. It simply goes to show that history is far more complex and messy than we sometimes realise, and that try as we might to arrange it in a neat and orderly sequence of events, the real world cannot so easily be fitted into tidy little boxes in this way.